Hey guys, so today we are doing the Russian Revolution or lesson 3 of Unit 12. And again, I've been telling you guys the reason why the Russian Revolution is in tandem, of course, with the unit over World War I is because it happens in the same time frame. Um, the Russian Revolution is going to get started in 1917, and it is going to be the reason why Russia has to withdraw from the war. And, of course, this happens at the same time that the United States actually enters the war. So the Allied side kind of stays balanced, so to speak. And actually, the United States entering helps out the Allies, much more so really than the Russians staying in the war were. But anyways, that's the reason why this is being talked about in the midst of the World War unit. So, this is just kind of really funny. I'm only showing my students the first couple of minutes because it just showcases that Russia was incredibly far behind the rest of Western Europe and really just kind of even Europe in general. Russia still had serfdom. They were still living like an almost like feudal existence in Russia, and it was, they were probably, you could easily say 100 years plus behind everybody else. I mean, it seriously, it was very much like the French Revolution. Prior to the French Revolution, you had, the men and women that were serfs just living in massive levels of poverty, whilst the aristocracy and especially the royal family just lived in absolute luxury. And of course, people, you add on a massive world war where millions and millions of Russian men are dying. And of course, the Tsar or the king of Russia himself is the leader and seems highly inept at what he's doing. I mean, like you throw all that into the mix, and I mean, revolution becomes kind of almost an inevitability. But again, we're only watching the first couple minutes of that just kind of as a humorous intro. But Russia, because they were so far behind the times, not just militarily but industrially, governmentally, I mean, like every which way that you can think of, they were behind. They were clearly not prepared to enter a world war and really be contenders. I mean, and they, they really just, because they had such a massive population, they just kept throwing more people at the problem more so than getting better at anything tactically or again, or even industrially in order to funnel the correct stuff into the soldiers to help them defend themselves. Prime example, you can't see this, but behind my head is actually a picture of a broomstick. And I always have students and they're like, what's going on? So they had so few supplies that the men weren't even trained with real weapons and real guns. They were sincerely trained with like broomsticks, play like that's a gun. And then in battle, they would be told when, not if, when the guy in front of you gets shot, pick up his rifle if he has one and you keep going. I mean, that was sincerely like their tactics. I mean, this is stuff that is being told to soldiers in their training program. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. And so, I mean, it's again very, very unprepared technologically, industrially, and then their leaders are also highly incompetent. The Tsar himself, who is just very, very timid, very, just not a natural born leader whatsoever. And just kind of a yes man. Like he was just gonna say, "Oh, okay," to all the advisors that were around him. Insisted on taking personal charge of the army again when he lacked any kind of really overall leadership abilities or training. And this, as you will see shortly, does not go well for him. So, to no big surprise, Russia loses more than anyone else in the war, even though by 1917 they actually withdraw. So, I mean, they even withdraw a year before the end of the war in 1918, and they still lose more than anybody else. 2 million soldiers are going to be killed, another 4 to 6 million wounded or captured. And so you can imagine, you add again that on top of just Russia being economically so downtrodden, and this huge gap between the rich and the poor still existing. I mean, it's no big shock that revolution is on the horizon. So Rasputin is a key figure in the Russian Revolution, and is just also an incredibly interesting historical figure to boot. So he is a just Russian peasant who is going to become a traveling monk and mystic. And he is going to kind of like go from Siberia, which is where he's from, and go from like town to town, healing people, kind of, he would supposedly, he would put his hands on people and they would be healed. I mean, just again, like this kind of almost divine figure, and this, again, this crazy, almost like cult following comes with Rasputin, and he makes his way to St. Petersburg, and he ends up, the royal family ends up hearing about him, and how he has all of these like healing abilities and things. And the public did not know this, but the royal family had 5 children, 4 daughters, and then finally the youngest was a son, Prince Alexei. And Alexei had hemophilia, so that means that your blood doesn't clot. And hemophilia can be incredibly lethal and dangerous, especially to young kids. When you're little, you get a bad scrape on your knee, or, you get a bad bruise and, oh, it hurts, but it'll scab over, no big deal. Well, a hemophiliac, that doesn't happen. I mean, you just keep bleeding and bleeding and bleeding and bleeding because your blood won't clot. And so, any little bump, bruise, because you have to think a bruise is internal bleeding, that has clotted, which is the reason why it gets that dark color. Well, that doesn't happen. You just sit there and internally bleed. And so, a lot of the doctors were saying, that even though this is your only boy, and oh my gosh, this is the prince that we all prayed for and heir to the throne, like he's probably not going to make it very long because he's a hemophiliac. And so they bring Rasputin into the palace to treat Alexei. And he tells them basically, like, you need to fire all of your doctors. Well, they do. And Alexei does get better. We'll come to find out it's because a lot of the doctors were giving him aspirin, which of course is a blood thinner. And that's like really, really bad for hemophiliacs. And so, he starts getting better. And so they immediately like take to him, and he becomes a hugely trusted member of the royal family and like inner council of the royal family. Well, like a lot of the poor people of Russia look to him and think like, oh my gosh, there's one of us in the palace, but the aristocracy can't stand him. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that they viewed him as like a con artist. Rasputin, yes, like he's this, Greek Orthodox or Eastern Orthodox monk and, religious holy man, but his personal life does not reflect this. He drinks a ton, parties a ton, is known to host parties where lots of women are there and things happen, and so, the aristocracy knows this about him and feels like the royal family is being led astray. And again, and so Rasputin ends up becoming this very kind of polarizing figure. And then when Tsar Nicholas actually goes off to war, there's this huge scandal that, propaganda gets placed in all the papers saying that Rasputin and the Tsarina Alexandra are actually having an affair. And I mean, so again, he ends up being this figure in Russian history that creates, again, resentment in some arenas towards the royal family that may not have been there prior really to Rasputin's arrival. So, again, there's lots of reasons why the Russian Revolution happens. Most of it being, economic, behind the times, World War One. But you also can't discount Rasputin as a part of the equation. So this is just a video about him. And then there's a very famous song about Rasputin. It's even on Just Dance, so that's why I was like, get after it. Try to do your best on Just Dance Rasputin. So, anyways, by March 1917, due again to World War I, inflation is awful. You end up on March 8th actually having a huge women's march. Again, like lots of parallels between Russian Revolution and French Revolution. In again, like in some arenas and some massively, hugely different stuff going on too. But there are some times where it looks pretty similar. They had big signs that said, we want just peace and bread, but also big signs that said down with the aristocracy. People wanted, prosperity. They wanted more say. They wanted equality. I mean, this is 1917, for goodness sakes, and Russia still has serfdom and a feudal system. People, like, back to the medieval unit. I mean, so again, it's no big shock that change was inevitable, and of course, any major change is a revolution. So, soon, in addition to the women, you have workers coming out of the factories that join and strike. And this ends up actually becoming known as the February Revolution of 1917, or the March Revolution. Russia actually has a differing calendar. They don't follow, of course, the traditional Gregorian calendar, and so they're always about a month off in these things. So just kind of, you're like, why does it one month and not the other? Well, it's because they actually follow a lunar calendar, so a little different. But Nicholas ends up making a really bad call in this moment and tells the troops to just basically like shoot into the crowd if necessary during the February march and during, again, the February Revolution. And soon, of course, and this happens, and, of course, this just angers people that are already angry with the crown even more. But then you also have some soldiers who join in with the crowds. And again, like, it becomes very obvious that you've got, a polarized Russia, but one overall that is highly frustrated with what is going on. And so the Tsar is going to end up actually having to abdicate. And the Duma, or the legislative body, is established as this provisional government in the meantime. So, the Duma, however, makes the really poor decision to stay in the war. And one of the biggest things that people wanted out of a new government, and once especially they felt like they had, yay, he's abdicated, was let's get out of the war. We need to focus on stuff back at home. And the Duma doesn't do that. So, the Soviets, one of the things that you need to understand, the Soviets are actually Russian councils, okay, that were composed of these differing representatives from, kind of the differing walks of life in Russia. And this is where you have communism start to come into play. It's through the Soviets. It's through these representative bodies that would then go and, talk to representatives of the Duma, or, you would have Duma representatives even coming out of the Soviets. And, this is where that kind of, hugely communist wave comes in, is through these Soviets. And so, again, you had very moderate Russians too. Actually, I would say the majority, more so the majority of Russians at the start of the Russian Revolution were moderates, more so than like way radical communists. But one particular group rose out of the Soviets called the Bolsheviks. And, they end up becoming this kind of major, political party in Russia during the time of the Russian revolutions. Again, they started out small, just in the Petrograd Soviet, but end up, becoming hugely influential because of Vladimir Lenin. So Lenin is actually exiled in Germany, and sent back to Russia by the Kaiser in a brilliant political move, in the fact that the Kaiser even tells Lenin, hey, we need you to go do what you do best, and that's be a revolutionary, so that Russia will focus in on that and get out of the war. And oh my gosh, like, check, that's exactly what happens. So, but Lenin becomes the leader of the Bolsheviks, and Lenin is, when it comes to being a revolutionary, he's all about, like, violence is the only way that you can have a revolution. Was highly, highly communist minded. Destroy capitalism. Destroy class systems in general. Like, truly live by a collective. But also, again, a very violent man. Said very impassioned speeches, and kind of that typical mold that you see in fascism, these like very bold, charismatic men that can make these fiery, inflammatory speeches that get everybody all riled up, and again, like, kind of can fuel violence with their rhetoric, in addition to their actions. And so, Lenin again becomes this voice of some of the people of Russia. Again, it really needs to be stated that actually at the beginning of the Russian Revolution, you had a lot of people that really weren't on Lenin's side. I mean, a lot of times there's this misconception that like all of Russia just loved Lenin and got behind him. And that couldn't be further from the truth, because again, you wouldn't end up having a Russian civil war directly after the Russian Revolution if everybody was on board. But most people are like, oh, well, the Russian Civil War was all about the people that were defending the crown versus the people who wanted Lenin's, communist Bolsheviks to win. And I'm like, well, actually, there were a heck of a lot of people kind of stuck in the middle, having to choose sides, going, I'm not a big Lenin fan. I'm also not a big like monarchy fan, but I guess if this is the side, these are the two sides of the fence I have to choose, then okay. And so again, I think that's important to understand as we go through this, is there were actually a lot of moderates, in the middle of all of this. And unfortunately, it turned into just these two groups. But, again, the Bolsheviks, their biggest thing that did attract a lot of people was they promised an end to the war. So that was like a big selling point. But then they also promised the redistribution of all land to peasants, because, that's a huge part, right, of communism, is the redistribution of wealth or land, because land is wealth, right? And this, again, this collective environment, of everyone being, equal, everyone sharing that piece of the pie, a transferal of factories and industries from capitalists to committees of workers. Again, government power goes into the hands of the Soviets. Again, this collective environment. So by the end of by the end of 1917 in October, the Bolsheviks make up, like it says, a slight majority in the Petrograd and Moscow Soviets. And these are just the Petrograd and Moscow Soviets. This is not all of Russia. Leon Trotsky is going to be the head of the Petrograd Soviet. And you end up with the Bolsheviks, yes, being in a position of power, but it's really because of Lenin's violence that they end up taking over. And this happens in the October Revolution. So again, November 6th. So I know it's weird, but it's because we're like a month off, but in our calendars. But November 6th, the Bolsheviks are going to seize the Winter Palace, which was the seat of the Duma, or the provisional government. The government's going to collapse very quickly. And, this is when the Bolsheviks are pretty much going to completely take over. Again, outwardly, Lenin made it look a lot more like politically correct than him taking over. But I mean, the reality was the October Revolution was Lenin and the Bolsheviks taking over Russia. Okay, so again, a lot of people, not just royalists, but people who don't like Lenin, but don't want necessarily to see the Tsar back on the throne either, oppose this. And this is how we end up with an immediate civil war right after, the revolution. So you end up with the White Army and the Red Army. Of course, the Red Army is, Lenin and the Bolsheviks. Your communists or your Red Army, your White Army are those that are pro-Tsar, or even, again, just like pro not Lenin and the Bolsheviks. During the time of the Civil War, what is going on with the royal family, right? They had been basically placed under house arrest for a while, but they were moved in April of 1918 to a pretty small mining town out close to the Ural Mountains, because they're trying to get them, of course, away from populated areas where people could potentially, monarchy supporters or loyalists could potentially smuggle them out. But anyways, they send them to this little town called Yekaterinburg. And on the night of July 16th, they actually are taken down into the basement of the house that they are being kept in. And they're told that it's because you had White Army forces coming into the town trying to liberate them. And the Red Army was engaging in fighting, and they didn't want the royal family to get hit by any gunfire that came through the window. All of this is total crap. They literally walked them down into the basement, and it was the royal family, which that just in and of itself was 6 people. And then there were, 7 people, sorry. And then there were 3 additional people with them, if I remember correctly. And they were all their closest staff, so, and, the Bolsheviks had the same amount of people waiting in the basement as there were members of the royal family and their household. And each person had been given 1 member to shoot and kill. They line them up and basically say, welcome to your death. And they shoot at them. But very few of them actually, and this is just where I'm sorry, this is just unfortunately a very graphic, sad part of Russian history. Only, I think, the Tsar and Alexei and 1 other member of the family, or no, maybe it wasn't Alexei. No, couldn't have been Alexei. I don't know. It was like the Tsar and 1 other person had died immediately. I can't really remember. Because they had gotten shot in an immediate kill spot. But the girls had sewn a lot of the royal jewels into their coats and stuff. And of course they were wearing those because, it wasn't appropriate at that time for you just go walking around in your nightgown. So they had put their coats on. And of course, the Bolsheviks didn't realize this. And so they go to shoot them, and the jewels actually act kind of like as armor. And, but, because they don't want the leaders of the Bolsheviks within this little town, because this is a little town, they don't want a bunch of people in the middle of the night hearing multiple rounds of gunshots. They say, don't fire your weapons again. And so they end up killing them, like by stabbing them. And it becomes very, very personal and very bloody. But anyways, they take them, and the whole point of taking them originally to a mine shaft, of course, was to burn the bodies and like bury them, that doesn't end up working out. So they end up taking them out to the woods outside of Yekaterinburg and burying them in unmarked graves. It's just a really horrific thing that ends up happening to the Romanov family. For a long time, the Bolsheviks come out originally and say that they had only killed the Tsar and if I remember correctly, the Tsarina, but like all the kids that that they hadn't killed the kids or something like that. I can't remember who all they said that they had killed or not killed at the beginning, but they lied about it. Later on, once they had completely secured power, like I think in the late 20s, they come out and say, no, like we've killed them all. And but there was all of this chatter, even after it had come out that they had killed all of the royal family, that Anastasia and Alexei had actually made it out some kind of way. And a lot of this has to do with the fact that the men that killed the royal family were all like wasted when they did it. And it was because this is a massive task being asked of these men to go in and kill the royal family. And, even if you are like a hardcore Bolshevik, that was kind of, and because the girls and the family in general were gorgeous. These and their daughters, they were just this beautiful family. And so, it's even said that the Bolsheviks were having to regularly switch the guards out that protected the family because they kind of kept being just, enthralled and enchanted by the girls and the family. But anyways, because more than likely much of that night was blurred for a lot of these men, like stories of what exactly happened got skewed. And how it is with rumorville. It was, you start out with one thing, and then by the time it's gone through the rumor mill, it's by 8,000 details has changed, and the truth is nowhere in sight. So people throughout the decades until the Soviet Union finally collapses, and then Russia finally allows, archaeologists to actually go into the forest and like try to dig their bodies up. People would come forward and say, like, I'm Anastasia or I'm Alexei. And there was one particular woman that lived in New York that had like artifacts and pictures and like pretty personal details about the royal family. And people believed her for years that she really was Anastasia. But obviously, once DNA testing happened in 2007, once all the bodies were exhumed and tested, showed that they all died that night in the horrific moment in history. So, in the end, how does Lenin and the communists win, right? Like, how do they not only win during the revolution, but then how do they win the Civil War? Well, the Red Army is highly disciplined, and Lenin is your typical like fear-mongering leader. Trotsky also reinstates the draft specifically for the Red Army. Again, soldiers who desert or refuse to obey are executed on the spot. Again, massive fear-mongering tactics taking place. Lenin and made no bones about it. Like, I will use violence. Violence is a part of revolution. If we want to get what we want, there has to be bloodshed and violence. I mean, he makes no bones about that at any point in time. And then you had, again, the disunity of anti-communist forces, because you had some people who were, in the White Army because they were highly loyal to the Tsar and his family, and they were true royalists, whereas others were like, I'm just not a Lenin supporter. So, again, you didn't have the complete overall conviction taking place in the White Army forces to have them win. And whereas communists were much more like single-minded. And so, again, the Red Army is going to end up winning the Civil War, and communism, and you end up with the Soviet Union, and communism is now completely the regime in what was Russia, but again is now the Soviet Union. So this is a good just kind of wrap up of everything, and trust me, there's more to come out of the Soviets in the next unit with Stalin and his role in World War II. And then, of course, we don't really get to talk much about the Cold War that starts in 1947, almost immediately after the end of World War II, that lasts until the Soviets fall in 1991. But next year in your U.S. history classes, you will talk a lot about that. So that is it for today. I will see you guys tomorrow, and hope you have had a good day. See you later.